The first sign that something was wrong did not come as a scream, a signal, or a cry for help, but as a ship that refused to behave like a ship should. On the morning of December 5th, 1872, the British brigantine De Gratia was moving steadily eastward across the Atlantic Ocean, her course set for Gibraltar, and her crew settled into the unremarkable rhythm of a routine crossing. The sea that morning was neither calm nor violent, but carried the long, deliberate swells that sailors recognized as the ocean at rest, rolling endlessly beneath a pale winter sky, without urgency or warning. It was during this quiet stretch of watchkeeping that the lookout noticed a vessel on the horizon whose motion seemed subtly, persistently wrong. Nothing about the ship appeared unusual. She was upright, intact, and under partial sail, her masts cutting cleanly against the sky. Yet, as the minutes passed and distance closed, it became clear that she was not responding to wind or current with the intention of a commanded vessel. Instead, she drifted across the swells at an angle, turning slightly, correcting nothing, surrendering control in a way that suggested not damage, but absence. Captain David Morehouse was summoned to the deck and raised his glass. Morehouse had spent most of his adult life at sea, and like all experienced captains, he had learned that ships communicated through posture long before any flag was raised or hail was answered. This ship carried the unmistakable posture of neglect. Her foresails were set improperly, her jib flapped loosely, and though the wind was steady enough to carry her forward, she made no attempt to hold a course. There were no figures on deck, no signal flags, and no smoke rising from the galley. When the distance narrowed enough for the name on her stern to become legible, recognition settled in with quiet unease. She was the Mary Celeste, an American merchant brigantine that had departed New York several weeks earlier, bound for Genoa with a cargo of industrial alcohol. Morehouse hailed her. The call carried cleanly across the water, but no voice returned it. He hailed again, louder this time, then once more, allowing space between each attempt, as maritime custom demanded. Yet the ship remained unresponsive, drifting silently, as though its purpose had already ended. With reluctance and caution, Morehouse ordered a boarding party assembled. The decision to board an unresponsive vessel was never casual, for such ships carried the unknown with them. Disease, violence, or structural failure could wait beyond the rail, and yet maritime law and long-standing seafaring custom demanded action. A drifting ship was a danger not only to itself, but to every vessel that might later cross its path. First Mate Oliver Devoe led the party across. As Devoe climbed aboard, he found nothing that matched the dread such silence often carried. The deck was wet from spray, but solid beneath his boots. The rails were firm. The masts stood true. The ship creaked gently, alive with the low, familiar sounds of wood under tension. This was not a ship that had been battered into submission by storm or accident. What unsettled him was not destruction, but order. Moving carefully along the deck, Devoe saw no signs of struggle or damage. The hatches were in place. The rigging showed no stress fractures or tears. Nothing lay overturned. Nothing appeared hurriedly abandoned. Below deck, the impression deepened. The galley bore evidence of recent use, with utensils neatly arranged and a kettle resting on the stove. Absent fire, but not neglected. In the crew quarters, bunks were made, or partially arranged. Boots stood near sleeping spaces, and personal belongings rested undisturbed, as though their owners expected to return within hours, rather than vanish entirely. When Devoe entered the captain's cabin, the character of the ship revealed itself most clearly. Captain Benjamin Briggs was known throughout the maritime trade as a disciplined, deeply religious man who prized order, caution, and responsibility. His cabin reflected those values. Charts were neatly stored. Papers lay carefully arranged. Navigation instruments were present, save for the sextant and chronometer, which were missing from their usual places, suggesting not theft, but deliberate removal. The logbook lay open on the desk. Its final entry was dated November 25th, 1872, and recorded a routine position, reading without alarm or commentary. The handwriting was steady, unhurried, and precise. There was no mention of danger, no reference to mechanical failure, weather distress, or crew unrest. And after that entry, the record ended entirely, as though the act of writing itself had simply been set aside. As the boarding party continued their inspection, a troubling pattern emerged. The cargo remained intact, with over 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol secured in the hold. A small number had leaked, but leakage was common in such shipments and insufficient to explain evacuation. There were no signs of fire, explosion, or heat damage. The air carried no trace of smoke. The ship had taken on some water, but not enough to threaten her seaworthiness. Her pumps were operational. Her hull showed no catastrophic breach. By all measurable standards, the Mary Celeste remained capable of completing her voyage. One absence, however, resisted explanation. The lifeboat was gone. Its ropes had not snapped under strain or storm, but had been cut cleanly, a detail that implied intent rather than panic. This distinction mattered deeply to men who understood the sea. Experienced sailors did not abandon a functioning ship unless they believed remaining aboard posed a greater danger than the open ocean itself. Captain Morehouse was informed of the findings, and the significance of the situation settled heavily upon him. Morehouse knew Briggs personally. Their paths had crossed in port. Their routes often mirrored one another. And Briggs's reputation as a careful, principled captain was widely respected. He was not a man prone to fear, nor one likely to endanger his crew without cause. Most telling of all, he had chosen to bring his wife and young daughter aboard for this voyage, a decision that reflected complete confidence in both vessel and passage. Whatever choice had been made aboard the Mary Celeste, it had been made by a man who believed he was acting to preserve life. Under maritime law, the Dei Gratia claimed the right to salvage the vessel, and a skeleton crew was assigned to guide her toward Gibraltar. The two ships sailed together, one fully manned and the other eerily intact, bound by proximity and unanswered questions. Upon arrival, authorities examined the Mary Celeste with exhaustive care. Surveyors inspected her hull, rigging, and interior. Officials reviewed testimony, logs, and cargo manifests. Every space was searched, every detail considered, and with each inquiry, certainty retreated further rather than advancing. There was no evidence of mutiny, no sign of violence, no indication of storm damage sufficient to force abandonment. Personal valuables remained untouched. The captain's family possessions were still in place. The ship's papers were orderly. Even the galley suggested interruption rather than flight. The crew had not fled in terror. They had left with purpose. As news spread, newspapers seized upon the strangeness of the event. transforming measured uncertainty into speculation and then into legend. Accusations, rumors, and embellishments filled the silence the sea refused to explain, while the simple, unsettling reality remained unchanged. A sound ship had been abandoned by capable people under conditions that did not require abandonment, for reasons that left no visible trace. The Mary Celeste did not present herself as a tragedy in progress. She presented herself as a decision already made. To understand that decision, one must move backward through time, beyond the drifting hull and the unanswered hails, to the ship's earlier life, when her decks were filled with voices, her routines predictable, and the sea still seemed governable. Because before she became a mystery, the Mary Celeste was something far more ordinary. She was a working ship, and it was within that ordinariness that the explanation, however incomplete, must begin. Long before she drifted without voices or purpose across the Atlantic, the ship that would later be known as the Mary Celeste was built to do exactly what ships had always done, which was to move quietly and reliably through the long arteries of global trade, carrying ordinary cargo for ordinary profit, without any expectation that her name would ever be remembered. She was constructed in 1861 on the shores of Spencer's Island, Nova Scotia, a place where shipbuilding was not an industry driven by ambition or spectacle, but by repetition and inherited knowledge, passed carefully from one generation of craftsmen to the next. The men who laid her keel did so with practiced confidence, shaping her hull from timber chosen for strength rather than elegance, knowing that durability mattered more than speed for a merchant vessel expected to cross the Atlantic again and again. At her launch, she bore a different name. She was christened the Amazon, and nothing about her suggested that she would become anything other than another dependable entry in the ledgers of Atlantic commerce. She was built as a brigantine, a design favored for its balance between cargo capacity and manageable crew size. And from the outset, she was intended to serve the steady, unspectacular demands of trade, rather than the glory of exploration or war. Yet almost immediately, her career took an unsettling turn. On her very first voyage, the Amazon sailed under the command of Robert McClellan, a man regarded as capable and experienced, whose familiarity with the vessel was expected to ensure a smooth introduction to service. Instead, within days of departure, McClellan fell violently ill and died aboard the ship, leaving the crew to return to port under the weight of a loss that was both sudden and deeply unsettling. Death at sea was not uncommon in the 19th century, but timing mattered, and the death of a captain so early in a ship's life carried with it a lingering discomfort that no official report could fully dispel. Sailors, though practical by necessity, were rarely indifferent to patterns, and the Amazon's first voyage ended with a sense that something had already gone awry. Misfortune continued to follow. Over the next several years, the ship changed hands repeatedly, passing from owner to owner as financial difficulties, accidents, and operational setbacks eroded confidence in her reliability. She suffered collisions in port, ran aground on at least one occasion, and required repairs that exceeded what many owners considered worthwhile for a vessel of her size. None of these incidents were extraordinary in isolation, yet together they formed a narrative of inconvenience and expense that clung stubbornly to the ship's reputation. Among sailors, stories accumulate quietly. They do not announce themselves as legends at first, but settle into conversation through repetition, each retelling smoothing edges while reinforcing the core belief that some ships carried more trouble than others. The Amazon began to acquire such a reputation, not as a cursed vessel in any dramatic sense, but as one that seemed persistently out of step with fortune, demanding more from her owners than she returned. Eventually, she was sold to new interests, repaired once more, and renamed. The act of renaming a ship was, for many sailors, an uneasy ritual. Officially, it signified a clean break from the past, a practical resetting of ownership and purpose. Unofficially, it was regarded with suspicion, as though a ship's history could not be erased simply by altering the letters on her stern. Nevertheless, in 1869, the Amazon became the Mary Celeste, her previous name struck from records and replaced with one intended to signal renewal rather than continuity. Under new ownership, she underwent further refurbishment, emerging structurally sound and commercially viable, with no defects that would later account for her abandonment. Her hull was reinforced, her rigging renewed, and her internal spaces reorganized to accommodate cargo more efficiently. In every measurable way, she was restored to the condition expected of a merchant vessel, preparing for regular transatlantic service. What remained unchanged, however, was her ordinariness. She was not fast enough to be admired, nor large enough to command attention, nor unusual enough to inspire commentary. She belonged to the vast, largely invisible fleet of working ships that sustained 19th century economies, carrying lumber, foodstuffs, fuel, and manufactured goods between continents that depended on wind and patience rather than engines and schedules. This ordinariness is essential to understanding what would later disturb investigators so deeply. Ships that disappeared under extraordinary circumstances were expected to have lived extraordinary lives, yet the Mary Celeste had been shaped almost entirely by routine. Her decks had known the steady footfalls of sailors performing familiar tasks. Her holds had carried cargo that posed little risk when properly managed, and her voyages followed established routes governed by seasonal winds rather than ambition. By the early 1870s, the Atlantic trade had become a disciplined system, supported by predictable weather patterns, improving navigational tools, and a growing body of shared maritime experience. While dangers remained, they were known dangers, and captains like Benjamin Briggs trusted not in luck, but in preparation and judgment. When the Mary Celeste was selected for her ill-fated voyage to Genoa, she was not chosen despite her past, but because her past no longer appeared relevant. She was seaworthy, insurable, and suitable for the task, carrying a cargo that thousands of ships had transported safely before her. Nothing about her suggested that she was approaching a moment that would sever her story from explanation. To the men who signed on, she was simply another ship, offering wages, passage, and the quiet promise of return. To her owners, she was an investment expected to perform within narrow margins. To the sea, she was indistinguishable from countless other hulls, tracing invisible lines across the water. And yet, when the Mary Celeste departed New York in November of 1872, she carried more than cargo and crew. She carried a history that had never quite settled, a sequence of events that had left behind no single cause for concern, but an accumulation of unease that only became visible in retrospect. At the time, none of it mattered. Ships did not sail on reputation alone, and sailors learned early that to dwell on past misfortune was to invite paralysis. The sea rewarded attention, not superstition, What followed would not emerge from dramatic failure or violent conflict, but from decisions made aboard a ship that had always existed in the narrow space between reliability and doubt. To understand those decisions, it is necessary to look not only at the vessel herself, but at the man who commanded her final voyage, and the quiet convictions that guided his judgment. It is to him and to the life he carried aboard with him that the story must now turn. Benjamin Spooner. Briggs had spent most of his life learning how to listen to the sea, not as something mystical or romantic, but as a system of signs, pressures, and patterns that rewarded attentiveness and punished neglect without emotion or warning. By the time he accepted command of the Mary Celeste, he was not a young man chasing opportunity, nor an aging captain clinging to relevance, but a seasoned mariner whose confidence had been built slowly, voyage by voyage, through repetition rather than risk. Born into a New England seafaring family, Briggs had gone to sea as a boy, as so many sons of coastal communities did, absorbing the discipline of shipboard life before he had fully learned the habits of land. The ocean shaped his education early, teaching him the value of routine, restraint, and foresight, lessons that would later define his reputation among both crew and owners. Those who sailed with him did not describe him as charismatic or severe, but as steady, a man whose authority came not from force of personality, but from consistency. By middle age, Briggs was regarded as reliable to the point of predictability, a trait that mattered deeply in an era when predictability often meant survival. He was known to be deeply religious, a devout Christian whose faith informed his sense of responsibility without interfering with his judgment. Unlike some captains who interpreted providence as a substitute for caution, Briggs saw preparation itself as a moral duty, believing that recklessness was not courage, but negligence. His logbooks reflected this mindset. Entries were clear, precise, and unemotional, recording positions, weather conditions, and minor adjustments with an even hand that suggested neither complacency nor anxiety. There were no flourishes, no reflections, and no indulgence in narrative. The sea, to Briggs, was not a story to be told, but a reality to be managed. It was this temperament that made him an appealing choice for the Mary Celeste's owners. The voyage from New York to Genoa was not considered especially dangerous, but it was commercially significant, involving a cargo of denatured alcohol intended for industrial use in Europe. Such cargo required careful handling and attentiveness to ventilation, and while it was not inherently unstable, it demanded a captain who understood both its properties and its risks. Briggs was precisely that kind of man. More telling than the cargo, however, was Briggs's decision to bring his family aboard. His wife, Sarah, was no stranger to the sea. She had sailed with him before, understood the rhythms of shipboard life, and accepted its inconveniences without complaint. Their young daughter, Sophia, was also to make the journey, a choice that carried weight beyond sentiment. Captains did not bring children aboard vessels they believed to be unsafe, nor did they expose their families to conditions they would not willingly endure themselves. This decision, more than any official endorsement, spoke to Briggs's confidence in the ship, the route, and his own judgment. Those who later speculated about panic or instability would struggle to reconcile such theories with this single fact. Briggs was not a man who gambled with his family's lives. His faith, his character, and his record all argued against impulsive behavior, particularly under conditions that could be assessed, managed, and mitigated through reason. In port, Briggs was described as quiet and reserved, more inclined toward conversation than command, yet unmistakably authoritative when responsibility demanded it. He did not tolerate disorder, but he did not cultivate fear. Crewmen who served under him later recalled a captain who expected competence and rewarded it with trust, who issued instructions clearly and intervened only when necessary. This balance mattered. A ship functioned not through constant oversight, but through the internal discipline of its crew, and Briggs understood that men who felt trusted were more likely to act decisively when conditions changed. He was not indulgent, but he was fair, a distinction that carried significant weight in an environment where hierarchy could easily slip into cruelty. When Briggs accepted command of the Mary Celeste, he did so without hesitation or ceremony. The ship had a past, but not one that concerned him. She was seaworthy, properly outfitted, and adequately insured. Her cargo was familiar. Her route was established. In the language of maritime decision-making, there were no red flags. In his private correspondence, Briggs expressed cautious optimism about the voyage, noting nothing more dramatic than hopes for favorable winds and a timely arrival. There were no expressions of concern, no references to unease, and no hint that he anticipated anything other than another routine crossing, followed by a return to work. This absence of foreboding is important. Later narratives would attempt to impose meaning on his choices, reading anxiety into silence and fear into preparation. Yet the historical record does not support such interpretations. Briggs's actions aligned perfectly with the habits of a man who believed that thoroughness was the best defense against uncertainty. The morning the Mary Celeste departed New York Harbor, Briggs was observed attending to details rather than ceremony. Cargo manifests were reviewed. Ventilation was discussed. Watch schedules were set. There were no speeches, no indulgent farewells, and no visible rituals marking departure. The ship slipped into open water, as thousands of others had done before her, unremarkable in motion and intention. If Briggs felt any unease, he did not record it. If he sensed danger, he did not signal it. What would later confound investigators was not the absence of evidence, but the presence of normalcy. Everything about Briggs' conduct suggested continuity rather than rupture, stability rather than decline. The man who would one day abandon a ship without visible cause was the same man who had spent decades avoiding precisely that kind of outcome. To understand what followed, it is necessary to hold this image of Briggs firmly in mind, not as a symbol or an archetype, but as a professional navigating familiar challenges with familiar tools. Whatever decision was made aboard the Mary Celeste in late November of 1872, it was made by a man whose instincts had been shaped by experience, whose faith emphasized responsibility, and whose life offered no precedent for reckless abandonment. The mystery of the Mary Celeste does not begin with a reckless captain. It begins with a careful one, and to see how that care expressed itself in daily life aboard the ship, the story must now widen to include the men who sailed under Briggs' command, each carrying his own reasons for stepping aboard, and each bound, however briefly, to the routines that governed life at sea. A ship was never defined solely by its captain, no matter how experienced or disciplined he might be, because command at sea depended on a shared structure of trust that extended downward through every rank, binding together men who, in many cases, had met only days before entrusting one another with their lives. The Mary Celeste's crew was small, as was typical for a brigantine of her size, yet each position aboard carried weight far beyond its title. These were not interchangeable labourers, but individuals whose judgment, habits, and endurance shaped the ship's daily reality in ways that rarely appeared in official records, but mattered profoundly when conditions changed. First among them was the ship's first mate, Albert Richardson, a sailor with years of Atlantic experience and a reputation for competence that closely mirrored Captain Briggs's own. Richardson had sailed under Briggs before, a fact that mattered more than formal credentials. Familiarity between captain and mate created a continuity of decision-making that could not be improvised mid-voyage, and Briggs valued this continuity deeply. Richardson was responsible for translating Briggs' intent into action, overseeing watches, managing sail handling, and maintaining order without unnecessary force. Men who served under him later described a mate who worked alongside the crew rather than above them, enforcing discipline through presence rather than punishment. In the quiet hierarchy of shipboard life, this approach fostered cooperation rather than resentment, a quality that would later complicate theories of conflict or rebellion. Serving as second mate was Andrew Gilling, younger than Richardson, but no novice to the sea. Gilling's role placed him between authority and labour, supervising watches and ensuring the ship's routines continued smoothly during long stretches when the captain was absent from the deck. His responsibilities required attentiveness rather than command, an ability to notice small deviations before they became large problems. Below them worked the steward, Edward William Head, whose presence shaped the ship's domestic rhythm. Head's duties extended beyond serving meals, encompassing the maintenance of living quarters and the quiet management of daily comfort, in an environment where comfort was always relative. The steward often observed more than he spoke, moving between spaces and overhearing fragments of conversation without being central to them, a role that made him uniquely aware of the ship's emotional climate. The remaining crew were seamen, men whose labour sustained the physical body of the ship. Volker Lorenzen and Arian Martens were both experienced sailors of German origin, accustomed to long voyages and the demands of transatlantic work. Their familiarity with rigging, sail handling, and maintenance placed them at the heart of the ship's functioning, where mistakes carried immediate consequences, and competence was measured daily rather than declared. Alongside them served Gottlieb Gutschat, whose responsibilities mirrored those of his fellow seamen, yet whose presence completed the crew's careful balance of skills. Each man had been selected not for distinction, but for reliability, forming a group capable of sustaining the ship's routines without excessive oversight. This composition matters. The Mary Celeste's crew was neither unusually large nor unusually strained. They did not represent a cross-section of desperation or inexperience, but rather the standard workforce of 19th century maritime trade, men who accepted risk as a condition of employment but did not seek it unnecessarily. Their backgrounds differed, their languages varied, yet the shared grammar of shipboard labour united them in a system where clarity and repetition governed behaviour. Daily life aboard the ship followed a structure so familiar that it often passed without remark. Watches rotated in predictable cycles. Sails were adjusted, lines checked, decks scrubbed, and cargo inspected. Meals were simple, prepared according to routine rather than appetite, and eaten when opportunity allowed. Conversation emerged in fragments, shaped by fatigue and proximity rather than leisure. Days blended into one another, marked more by weather and light than by calendar or clock. Within this rhythm, relationships formed quietly. Trust at sea was not built through confession or camaraderie, but through performance. A man who handled a line correctly in heavy wind earned confidence more effectively than any declaration of loyalty. Over time, such confidence accumulated, producing a collective awareness that allowed the ship to function even when individuals rested or withdrew. Nothing in these routines suggested fracture. There were no recorded disputes, no disciplinary actions, and no indications of unrest. The crew's conduct in port had been unremarkable, their preparations methodical, their departure uneventful. They sailed under a captain they respected, on a ship deemed sound, carrying cargo that demanded attention but not alarm. This normalcy is what later unsettled investigators most deeply. When ships vanished or were found abandoned, there was usually a narrative available to explain the absence, whether rooted in violence, desperation, or overwhelming force. In the case of the Mary Celeste, no such narrative presented itself readily, because the human elements aboard her pointed towards stability rather than strain. These men did not appear poised on the edge of conflict. They appeared engaged in the business of getting from one port to another. To imagine their disappearance, one must imagine not a moment of chaos, but a moment of decision, reached collectively or accepted collectively, under circumstances that persuaded each individual that leaving the ship was preferable to remaining aboard it. Such persuasion would have needed to overcome experience, habit, and the powerful reluctance sailors felt toward abandoning a vessel that still floated and responded. That reluctance was ingrained. Seamen were taught early that lifeboats were last resorts, exposed to the elements and incapable of sustaining life for long in open water. To step into one voluntarily required a belief that the ship itself had become a greater danger than the sea surrounding it. Yet nothing in the known character of this crew suggests impulsiveness or fear. They were men accustomed to discomfort, to uncertainty, and to calculated risk. Whatever choice they made, it would not have been made lightly, nor by a single voice overriding the rest. It would have emerged from discussion, observation, and the shared language of maritime judgment. To understand how such a moment could arise, it is necessary to look more closely at the voyage itself, not as a mystery unfolding, but as a sequence of ordinary days, governed by routine, weather, and small decisions that rarely attract attention until viewed in hindsight. It is there, within the calm continuity of the journey, that the story must now continue. When the Mary Celeste finally slipped her moorings in New York Harbor on November 7th, 1872, there was nothing about her departure that distinguished it from the countless sailings that occurred along the eastern seaboard each year. And that absence of drama would later become one of the most difficult facts to reconcile with what followed. The harbor itself was alive with movement. Steamships passed outward bound, their engines churning steadily, while smaller sailing vessels threaded between them, relying on wind, tide, and long familiarity with the water. Dock workers finished their tasks with practiced indifference. Cargo lists were checked one last time, and the routines of maritime commerce unfolded with the efficiency of repetition rather than the anticipation of consequence. Captain Briggs oversaw the final preparations without haste. The cargo had been loaded carefully. 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, stowed securely in the hold. each sealed and inspected according to standard practice. Alcohol was a common cargo in the transatlantic trade, used widely in industrial and medical applications, and while it required respect and ventilation, it was not regarded as especially dangerous when handled properly. Briggs had transported similar cargo before and understood both its properties and its limits. Ventilation hatches were checked and adjusted. The condition of the barrels was noted. Nothing suggested instability, leakage beyond the ordinary, or the need for special concern. The ship's papers were in order, her insurance secured, and her destination clear. With sails set and course established, the Mary Celeste moved down the harbour and out into open water, leaving behind the dense geometry of masts and piers for the wide, unstructured space of the Atlantic. As the shoreline receded, the ship's world narrowed to timber, canvas, and horizon, and the rhythms of sea life began to assert themselves. The first days passed without incident. Winds were moderate and favourable, allowing the ship to make steady progress eastward. The crew settled into their watches, adjusting sails, maintaining rigging, and performing the small, continuous tasks that kept the vessel responsive and balanced. Meals were prepared and eaten according to routine. The ship moved, the sea answered, and nothing demanded deviation from expectation. Captain Briggs recorded positions in the log with his usual precision, noting weather conditions, sail configurations, and daily progress. These entries, later examined in detail, offer no hint of tension or concern. They reflect the mindset of a captain engaged in competent management rather than crisis response. A man overseeing a voyage unfolding as planned. Sarah Briggs adapted easily to shipboard life. She occupied her time reading, caring for her daughter, and attending to the domestic spaces that softened the ship's austerity. Sophia, too young to understand the significance of the journey, experienced the voyage as a sequence of sensations rather than events. The roll of the ship, the sounds of rigging, and the presence of familiar voices shaping her small world. Their presence aboard did not disrupt the ship's routine, but integrated into it, reinforcing the sense that this was a voyage intended to be endured rather than survived. Below deck, the cargo remained stable. The alcohol barrels were inspected periodically, as was customary, with no signs of widespread leakage or dangerous vapor accumulation. Minor seepage occurred in a small number of casks, but such leakage was neither unexpected nor immediately hazardous, and there is no indication that it caused alarm in the early stages of the voyage. The Atlantic, for its part, offered no challenge beyond the ordinary. Winds shifted, as they always did. Swells rose and fell. The ship adjusted and continued. There were no storms severe enough to warrant concern, no sudden changes in barometric pressure, and no navigational hazards that would have required extraordinary measures. The Mary Celeste behaved as she was designed to behave, responding predictably to the forces acting upon her. This predictability is crucial. Voyages that ended in disaster often left traces of escalating tension in their records, subtle changes in tone or detail that hinted at growing unease. In the case of the Mary Celeste, the early portion of the journey remained stubbornly unremarkable, marked by continuity rather than disruption. Even the interactions among the crew suggest stability. There are no reports of disputes, no indications of disciplinary issues, and no evidence that morale suffered in the opening days. The men worked, rested, and repeated, bound by routines that minimized the need for improvisation. This was precisely how successful voyages were meant to unfold, with nothing demanding attention beyond the immediate requirements of the ship. As days passed and the distance from land increased, the ship entered a familiar psychological space shared by all long crossings, where time stretched and contracted unpredictably, measured not by clocks, but by light, weather, and the completion of tasks. In such conditions, attention often narrowed, focusing inward on the ship itself, rather than outward on the vastness surrounding it. It was within this narrowing of focus that the seeds of later interpretation would be planted. Small observations, insignificant in the moment, could later acquire exaggerated meaning, while larger contextual factors faded into the background. Yet at this stage, there is no evidence that any such observations stood out, no record of discussions that hinted at concern, and no suggestion that the ship's routine masked hidden danger. The Mary Celeste continued eastward, day after day, following a path traced by countless vessels before her, guided by winds that were well understood and navigational methods that had proven reliable over decades of practice. If there was a moment when certainty began to erode, it did not announce itself loudly. It did not arrive as a single event or a dramatic shift, but would have emerged gradually through a convergence of factors that, taken individually, seemed manageable, but together may have altered perception in subtle, cumulative ways. To reach that moment, the story must move forward into the later days of the voyage, when conditions remained outwardly stable, even as the logic that governed decision-making began to shift beneath the surface. It is there, in the quiet space between routine and doubt, that the Mary Celeste's story takes its most enduring turn. As November drew toward its final week, the voyage of the Mary Celeste entered a phase that would later be examined with a level of attention no one aboard could have anticipated at the time. Not because events suddenly turned violent or dramatic, but because subtle changes began to accumulate in ways that were easy to manage individually and difficult to interpret collectively. The ship was now well into the Atlantic crossing, far from the certainty of land and fully committed to the logic of the sea, where decisions were shaped not by urgency alone, but by the balance between caution and continuity. The winds remained serviceable, though less consistent than before, and the weather showed signs of variability that, while not alarming, required closer observation. Such conditions were familiar to experienced sailors, especially in late autumn, when the Atlantic often shifted between cooperation and resistance without warning. Captain Briggs continued to maintain his log with the same measured precision that characterized his earlier entries. Positions were recorded regularly. Weather conditions were noted without embellishment. There were references to wind direction, sail adjustments, and progress made, all expressed in language that suggested attention rather than anxiety. There was no indication that Briggs believed the ship to be in danger, nor that he perceived his command as anything other than operational. At some point during these later days, the ship encountered rougher seas. The motion of the vessel would have increased, causing barrels in the hold to shift slightly against their stowage, and the hull to work more actively against the pressure of waves. Such movement was not unusual, but it had consequences that required assessment. Some of the alcohol casks began to leak more noticeably, releasing fumes into the lower spaces of the ship, a phenomenon well understood by sailors who transported volatile cargo. Alcohol vapor, while not inherently explosive under open-air conditions, could create an environment that felt threatening, particularly in confined spaces where ventilation was compromised by weather or sail configuration. The smell alone could be disorienting, and prolonged exposure was known to cause headaches, dizziness, and confusion, symptoms that might prompt concern without pointing clearly to a single cause. There is no record that the crew panicked. There is, however, reason to believe that Briggs was attentive to the situation, as any responsible captain would have been. Ventilation would have been adjusted where possible. Inspections would have been conducted. The ship's pumps, which were later found in working order, may have been tested as a precaution, particularly if water had entered the hold during heavier seas. It is important to understand how such factors interacted. A ship taking on a modest amount of water was not necessarily in danger, but water combined with shifting cargo, fumes, and uncertain weather could alter a captain's assessment of risk. None of these elements alone demanded abandonment, yet together they may have produced a growing sense that the situation required active mitigation rather than passive endurance. The final log entry was made on November 25, 1872. It recorded the ship's position as being near the Azores, placing the Mary Celeste within a known and frequently traversed region of the Atlantic. The entry itself was unremarkable in tone, noting position and conditions without reference to distress. There was no hint that it would be the last record of human intent aboard the ship. And then, the log ended. There were no subsequent entries to mark course corrections, weather changes, or routine observations, a silence that would later be interpreted in countless ways. At the time, however, this silence likely reflected not catastrophe, but interruption, a moment when attention shifted from record-keeping to immediate concern, whether practical or precautionary. What followed must be reconstructed indirectly. At some point, after that final entry, Captain Briggs and his crew appear to have reached a conclusion that remaining aboard the ship posed a risk greater than leaving it, at least temporarily. The absence of chaos aboard the vessel suggests that this conclusion was not reached in panic, but through discussion and observation, guided by the same cautious temperament that had defined the voyage from its outset. The lifeboat was prepared deliberately. Its ropes were cut cleanly rather than torn loose, indicating the use of tools and time rather than desperation. Essential navigational instruments were taken, suggesting an intention to maintain bearings and orientation. The crew did not scatter personal belongings, nor did they attempt to salvage valuables, choices consistent with an expectation of return rather than final escape. One plausible scenario, supported by later analysis, is that Briggs feared a sudden accumulation of alcohol vapor, possibly combined with water ingress, and chose to move his family and crew temporarily into the relative safety of the open air, tethered to the ship, until conditions could be reassessed. In such a situation, the lifeboat would have been viewed not as an abandonment vessel, but as a precautionary platform. The sea, however, rarely cooperates with intentions. If the lifeboat was secured to the ship by a line, as some theories suggest, a sudden change in weather or sea state could have severed that connection without warning, leaving the boat adrift while the Mary Celeste continued on under sail. In the vastness of the Atlantic, even a short separation could become permanent within minutes. This explanation, while not provable, aligns closely with the evidence that remains. It accounts for the absence of disorder, the deliberate nature of the preparations, and the failure to return. It also preserves the logic of a captain who acted cautiously rather than impulsively responding to a perceived threat with a measured, if ultimately fatal, decision. What it does not provide is certainty. The sea left no witnesses to confirm the sequence of events, no survivors to describe the moment when precaution turned into loss. All that remains are the conditions under which the decision was made, the traces of intent preserved aboard the ship, and the knowledge that whatever occurred unfolded quietly, without violence or resistance. When the Mary Celeste was later found drifting, she carried with her not the evidence of disaster, but the imprint of a choice that had been overtaken by forces too subtle and too vast to record. And it was that quiet imprint, more than any dramatic theory, that would trouble those who examined her in the years to come. When the boarding party from the Dei Gratia finished their first careful circuit of the Mary Celeste, the conclusion they reached was not one of fear, but of confusion, because every element of the vessel's condition appeared to contradict the assumption that her crew had fled from immediate danger. Ships abandoned in crisis usually told their story plainly. Storm damage left broken spars and shredded canvas. Violence left disorder, blood, or at least signs of struggle. Fire scorched wood and blackened metal. Panic scattered belongings and overturned furniture. The Mary Celeste displayed none of these things, and it was this absence, rather than any single clue, that gave the ship her unsettling character. The deck showed normal wear from weather and use, but no structural damage. The rigging was serviceable. The sails, though improperly set, were not torn or burned. The hatches were in place, and the companionways showed no sign of forced entry or hurried escape. Everything suggested interruption rather than collapse. Below deck, this impression deepened. The crew's quarters remained orderly, with personal items left behind in a manner inconsistent with flight. Clothing, boots, and tools were arranged as though the men had stepped away with the expectation of returning. There was no evidence that anyone had attempted to gather supplies beyond what would have been necessary for a brief absence, and no signs that panic had overridden habit. In the galley, the scene was particularly revealing. Cooking implements were stored properly, not abandoned mid-task, and though no fire burned in the stove, there was nothing to suggest a sudden emergency had drawn the crew away in haste. Meals had not been prepared for evacuation. Water casks and provisions remained aboard in sufficient quantity to sustain the crew for weeks. Yet none had been transferred to the lifeboat beyond what would have been considered essential. The captain's cabin reinforced this pattern of deliberate restraint. Charts were neatly stored, papers arranged, and the ship's documentation intact. The absence of navigational instruments, particularly the sextant and chronometer, was significant, but it pointed toward planning rather than theft or disorder. These were tools a captain would take if he believed he would need to navigate independently, even briefly, not items he would abandon or discard. The condition of the cargo provided further contradiction. The barrels of denatured alcohol were largely intact, with leakage limited to a small number of casks, consistent with normal conditions during rough seas. There was no evidence of fire, explosion, or structural compromise caused by the cargo, and no indication that fumes had ignited or damaged the interior of the ship. While the smell of alcohol lingered in the hold, it was not overwhelming, nor did it suggest an environment on the verge of catastrophe. Water had entered the ship, but not in alarming quantities. The bilge contained water, typical of a working vessel, and the pumps were functional and capable of managing it. There was no flooding that would have rendered the ship unstable or demanded immediate evacuation. The Mary Celeste, by every practical measure, remained seaworthy. The single most consequential detail was the absence of the lifeboat. Its removal had been accomplished cleanly, with ropes cut rather than broken, implying time, tools, and composure. The crew had not scrambled for escape under duress, nor had they abandoned the ship in chaos. They had prepared, executed, and left behind a vessel that showed no sign of resisting their departure. This was the paradox that would frustrate every subsequent inquiry. If the ship was safe, why leave it? If it was unsafe, why did it show no sign of danger? If the crew believed they would not return, why leave behind provisions, valuables, and shelter? And if they intended to return, what prevented them from doing so? The Mary Celeste did not answer these questions. Instead, she preserved a moment frozen between intention and outcome, a ship caught in the narrow space between caution and catastrophe. The physical evidence suggested a decision made in good faith, based on a perceived threat that either resolved itself too late or was misunderstood entirely. When officials later examined the vessel in Gibraltar, they found themselves retracing the same circuit as the Dei Gracia's boarding party, noting the same contradictions and arriving at the same unresolved conclusions. Each inspection confirmed that the ship had not been abandoned because it was failing, but because it was feared. Fear, however, leaves fewer traces than damage. It exists in judgment rather than structure, in anticipation rather than reaction. And when it proves unwarranted, it leaves behind a record that feels incomplete rather than wrong. The Mary Celeste embodied this incompleteness, presenting investigators with a ship that had been left for reasons that no longer existed by the time she was found. This distinction mattered profoundly. It shifted the focus of inquiry away from catastrophe and toward decision-making, away from what happened to the ship and towards what was believed to be happening aboard her. In doing so, it transformed the Mary Celeste from a maritime incident into a psychological puzzle, one rooted in the limits of perception under uncertain conditions. As the ship was guided into port and prepared for formal proceedings, the evidence she carried remained stubbornly neutral, offering no clear accusation and no definitive explanation. What followed would not be an investigation of wreckage or crime, but a search for motive, shaped by law, money, and suspicion rather than storm or fire. It was in that search, conducted far from the open sea and governed by human interest rather than natural forces, that the story of the Mary Celeste would take its next, and in many ways, most revealing turn. When the Mary Celeste finally arrived in Gibraltar, she carried not only barrels of alcohol, but a growing aura of questions and conjecture. The ship herself, intact and orderly, became a silent witness to her own story, while the human machinery of maritime law, commerce, and suspicion moved into motion to interpret the evidence she bore. Maritime law dictated that ships found abandoned were entitled to salvage rights, and under this principle, the crew of the Dei Gratia, Captain David Morehouse and his men, were considered potential claimants. They had discovered the Mary Celeste drifting aimlessly, boarded her at risk to themselves, and had guided her into port. On paper, the rules of salvage were clear. In practice, they opened the door to intense scrutiny, suspicion, and public speculation. Gibraltar, a strategic British port perched on the edge of the Mediterranean, became a stage where fact and imagination collided. Officials examined the Mary Celeste with meticulous care, measuring her timbers, inspecting the rigging, and accounting for every cask in her hold. Surveyors documented the condition of her decks, her galley, her cabin, and the crew's quarters. Every element was photographed, or, in this pre-photography age, sketched and described, to ensure a permanent record. The first questions posed by authorities were simple in wording, yet profound in implication. Why had the ship been abandoned? Was there evidence of foul play? Had the discoverers, the crew of the Dei Gratia, intervened beyond their legal right, or even caused harm? Morehouse and his men faced these questions with patient clarity. They recounted every step of the boarding, every observation, every decision made to navigate the Mary Celeste safely into port. The orderly condition of the ship, they explained, left no indication that the crew had been removed against their will. The cargo was intact, the cabins unaltered, and there was no sign of violence anywhere aboard. Yet, despite their testimony, suspicion persisted. Some officials, influenced by the sensationalism of newspapers and the lore of ghost ships, speculated that Morehouse's crew might have induced abandonment for profit. The alcohol cargo was valuable, and the potential salvage claim was substantial. Could these men have persuaded or coerced the crew into leaving, and then claimed reward for themselves? The answer, while obvious in hindsight, was complicated in context. The boarding party's conduct had been scrupulous. No items were removed beyond the provisions necessary for the short voyage into Gibraltar, and no injuries were reported. Still, the human tendency to infer motive in the absence of explanation created a cloud that could not easily be dispersed. The hearings proceeded slowly, conducted in the formal halls of Gibraltar's Admiralty courts. Lawyers, officials, and witnesses converged, each bringing their interpretations, fears, and speculations. The captain and crew of the Mary Celeste had vanished, and in their absence, imagination filled the void. The orderly condition of the ship became a source of suspicion rather than reassurance, as observers struggled to reconcile a lack of evidence with the necessity of explanation. Investigators dissected every detail: the missing lifeboat, the absence of the sextant and chronometer, the small quantity of water in the hold, and the intact but slightly leaking barrels of alcohol. All of it became part of an intricate puzzle, one that resisted any simple solution. To some, the missing lifeboat suggested escape under duress. To others, the absence of the captain's navigational tools suggested premeditated planning. To none, however, did it provide certainty. In the public eye, the hearings amplified the mystery. Newspapers across Europe and America reported each observation, each theory, and each accusation with a mixture of fascination and alarm. Letters, editorials, and commentary presented the Mary Celeste alternately as a ghost ship, a victim of misfortune, and a potential scene of crime. The legal proceedings, meant to establish salvage rights, instead became a stage for cultural speculation, where rumor flourished alongside fact. Despite the clamor, the courts ultimately recognized the principles of maritime law. The crew of the Dei Gratia were awarded salvage rights, though reduced in part to reflect the extraordinary circumstances and the lingering questions surrounding the vessel's abandonment. No formal charges were laid against them, and no criminal wrongdoing was established. Yet even as the hearings concluded, the Mary Celeste remained an enigma. The ship itself offered no testimony, and the absence of her crew continued to dominate every discussion. For all the legal scrutiny, no document, no observation, and no testimony could explain why a fully seaworthy vessel, commanded by an experienced captain and attended by a competent crew, had been abandoned in the warm Atlantic without a trace of violence, struggle, or disorder. It was within this tension, between legal resolution and human curiosity, that the legend of the Mary Celeste began to solidify. She was no longer merely a ship that had drifted across the ocean. She had become a symbol of uncertainty, an enduring question whose answer was as inaccessible as the sea itself. Even in the sterile halls of Gibraltar, surrounded by charts, logs, and witnesses, the Mary Celeste refused to yield a narrative. She was intact, orderly, and silent, carrying with her the faintest traces of decisions that had already vanished, decisions that would remain unknowable to any who sought them. And it was precisely this combination of procedural resolution and continued mystery that ensured the story would not end in Gibraltar, nor in the 19th century. The Mary Celeste's voyage had concluded, but her presence, silent and uncompromising, had only begun to captivate the world. Once the Mary Celeste had been brought safely into port and the formalities of the salvage hearings were complete, the ship entered a far larger and far less predictable arena, the court of public imagination. News of her abandonment spread swiftly across newspapers in Europe and America, carried not only by telegraph and dispatches, but by a human fascination with mystery and the inexplicable. The world's reaction would transform a simple maritime incident into a story that blurred the line between fact and legend. Editors and journalists seized upon the image of a ship found perfectly intact yet deserted, a vessel whose decks, cabins, and cargo offered no obvious reason for evacuation. Each description emphasized the eerie normality of the scene: neatly arranged belongings, meals unprepared but utensils in order, bunks made, charts carefully stored, and a lifeboat gone, cut from its mooring. The newspapers could not resist framing the narrative as a puzzle, and in doing so, they transformed it into a sensation. Readers were enthralled. Letters poured into editors' offices, speculating about mutiny, piracy, sea monsters, or sudden catastrophe. Some suggested supernatural interference. Others theorized gas explosions, alcohol fumes igniting fear among the crew, or secret plots by the De Gratia's crew. The sheer number of theories demonstrated a universal human need to impose causality on the seemingly incomprehensible. In reality, the Mary Celeste had been abandoned with no trace of violence, struggle, or forced intervention. Yet these facts were insufficient to satisfy curiosity, and public imagination inevitably filled the gaps. The ship became an archetype of the ghost vessel, even though, as anyone who boarded her could attest, there was nothing ghostly about her structure, her cargo, or her operation. Her silence and intact state were enough to evoke a sense of the uncanny. Some newspapers began to embellish the story further, claiming sightings of the crew in distant ports, attributing impossible acts to the captain, or speculating about invisible perils that might have compelled the crew to leave. These accounts often contradicted one another, but their contradictions only enhanced the allure. Each retelling added detail that could not be verified, layering fiction over fact in ways that would persist for generations. The Mary Celeste's fame grew in part because of her ambiguity. Unlike ships destroyed in storms or consumed by fire, she left behind no definitive evidence to explain her abandonment. Her condition suggested no immediate threat, yet the crew had vanished. This paradox became central to the story, a tension that allowed readers and writers to project their own fears, suspicions, and interpretations onto the ship. The absence of certainty gave the narrative its enduring power. Maritime authorities, meanwhile, grew frustrated with the proliferation of speculative accounts. Investigators had conducted careful examinations, noting the ship's seaworthiness, the absence of damage, and the lack of disorder. They recorded every observation, yet their methodical findings were often overlooked in favor of sensationalized storytelling. Newspapers preferred drama to nuance, leaving the public with a vision of a ship mysteriously abandoned for reasons that could only be imagined. Among historians and seafarers, discussion turned toward practical explanations. Alcohol fumes and the potential risk of explosion, sudden weather changes, or misinterpretation of minor flooding were suggested as plausible reasons for abandonment. Even so, these explanations could not account fully for the deliberate manner in which the crew left, taking navigation tools and preparing the lifeboat carefully while leaving other valuables and provisions untouched. The decision-making remained a riddle. Over time, the Mary Celeste became more than a ship. She became a symbol. She represented the sea's power to render human control provisional, to challenge judgment even when decisions were made carefully and rationally. She demonstrated that ordinary, disciplined lives could intersect with forces beyond comprehension, producing outcomes that were inexplicable, yet coherent in retrospect. Books and articles appeared, retelling her story with increasing flourish. The line between reportage and legend blurred. For many readers, the ship was no longer a merchant brigantine. She was a narrative space into which fears, wonders, and curiosity could be projected. Authors speculated about mutiny, piracy, and supernatural intervention, often ignoring or downplaying the sober facts recorded by the boarding party and investigators. Yet beneath all the sensationalism, the historical truth persisted, available to those willing to examine the evidence carefully. A well-built, seaworthy ship, commanded by an experienced captain, manned by a competent crew, and abandoned under circumstances that remain partly obscured by time. The contrast between this reality and the stories that flourished around her created a tension that continues to fascinate historians, sailors, and the general public alike. By the late 19th century, the Mary Celeste had achieved a dual existence. She was both an ordinary merchant ship, defined by her cargo, her crew, and her construction, and a vessel of legend, defined by absence, silence, and unanswered questions. In every account, one fact remained constant. The human choices aboard her, whatever their nature, left a record that was deliberate, orderly, and ultimately mysterious. It is in this space, between careful observation and wild speculation, that the Mary Celeste's story entered history. She became an enduring testament to the unpredictability of the sea, the subtlety of human judgment under stress, and the persistent allure of the unknown. Her fame was not earned by catastrophe alone, but by the combination of normalcy and disappearance, a tension that continues to draw attention over a century later. And yet, even amid the fascination, one question persisted with unmatched intensity. Where did Captain Briggs, his wife, his daughter, and the crew go? The answer, lost in the vastness of the Atlantic, would remain a matter of conjecture, hypothesis, and imagination, a mystery anchored in the quiet spaces of decision rather than the violent ones of disaster. As the Mary Celeste settled into legend, the absence of concrete answers invited an extraordinary proliferation of theories. Scholars, sailors, journalists, and amateur investigators alike sought to reconstruct a narrative from the fragments she left behind. Each theory, whether mundane or fantastical, reflected both the human desire for explanation and the limitations imposed by incomplete evidence. One of the earliest and most widely considered explanations focused on the ship's cargo: denatured alcohol. Chemically volatile and prone to producing flammable vapors, the alcohol could, under certain conditions, have created an atmosphere that seemed threatening to the crew. Slight leakage, combined with rough seas that rocked the barrels, may have amplified odors or produced hissing sounds as pressure built in the casks. To sailors unfamiliar with the precise risks or unwilling to wait and test the situation cautiously, this could have been interpreted as imminent danger. Yet, the alcohol theory alone could not account for every detail. The crew had been experienced, aware of the properties of their cargo, and trained to respond to such contingencies. Captain Briggs, in particular, had overseen numerous voyages with hazardous cargo and maintained careful protocols for storage and ventilation. If the alcohol fumes were genuinely frightening, it was likely due to a rare combination of factors: the precise degree of leakage, the movement of the ship in swells, and perhaps even a misreading of risk amplified by the confined, low-lit environment of the hold. Weather also featured prominently in early speculations. The Atlantic in late November is notoriously unpredictable, and sudden squalls or rogue waves can appear with little warning. Some historians have proposed that Briggs, observing unusual movement of water in the bilge or a rapid change in wind and swell, may have temporarily evacuated the ship as a precaution. In this scenario, the lifeboat would have been intended for a brief, tethered sortie to assess conditions or repair a suspected leak. Whatever occurred next, possibly a sudden shift in wind or a severed line, would have left the Mary Celeste behind, while her occupants were carried away by the very sea they had sought to measure and mitigate. Another possibility invoked simple human error. Even the most careful captain can misread signals or overestimate danger. Perhaps a small, ordinary problem: water in the hold, slipping cargo, or an odor that suggested fire, was amplified by cumulative stress, unfamiliarity with the immediate conditions, or a momentary lapse in judgment. This would explain why the lifeboat was taken deliberately rather than abandoned in panic. The crew acted rationally under perceived threat, but the outcome defied expectation. Less plausible, but historically persistent, were theories of piracy or mutiny. Some observers suggested that the crew might have been persuaded or coerced into leaving the ship, either for personal gain or under threat. These ideas, though dramatic, found little support in evidence. There were no signs of struggle. The cargo remained largely intact, and the captain's navigational instruments, tools that would have been of value to anyone attempting theft, were missing, but other valuables were untouched. Mutiny seems unlikely, given the documented competence, cohesion, and previous service records of the men aboard. Even more speculative were the supernatural and literary interpretations that emerged almost immediately after the ship's discovery. Ghosts, sea monsters, or invisible forces were invoked in articles and pamphlets, reflecting the era's fascination with maritime mystery. These accounts, while culturally significant, offer no insight into the historical reality, though they contributed enormously to the enduring mystique of the Mary Celeste. Scientific attempts at explanation, however, brought some grounding. Studies of alcohol vapor behavior in confined spaces suggested that the fumes could be perceived as threatening without reaching actual combustive danger. Analyses of bilge water, ship stability, and lifeboat design indicated that the vessel herself remained fully capable of remaining afloat indefinitely. Together, these findings reinforced the notion that the abandonment was likely precautionary rather than compelled by immediate physical peril. What emerges from these theories is not certainty, but context. The Mary Celeste was a ship designed to endure ordinary hazards. She was commanded by a captain who had spent decades mastering risk. Her crew was competent and experienced. Yet the sea, with its capacity for subtle signals, created conditions in which rational actors could make decisions that, to observers after the fact, appear inexplicable. Ultimately, the mystery is less about what the sea did to the Mary Celeste than about how human perception interacts with risk and uncertainty. Every hypothesis acknowledges the same facts. The ship was seaworthy. The crew vanished. The lifeboat was taken. And no violence occurred aboard. Beyond these constants, interpretation diverges according to the observer's perspective, imagination, or understanding of maritime practice. Theories have evolved over the decades, refined by science, historical records, and an appreciation for human psychology. Yet none have conclusively resolved the central question: why would a competent captain and his crew leave an intact, functioning ship in mid-Atlantic? The Mary Celeste's story persists because it resists closure, inviting each new generation to approach it with curiosity, caution, and wonder. Even today, historians and maritime experts continue to debate the probabilities of the various scenarios. The ship has become a case study in decision-making under uncertainty, a rare convergence of ordinary conditions and extraordinary consequences. Her story exemplifies the tension between empirical evidence and human perception, a tension that ensures she remains a subject of fascination more than 150 years after her disappearance. And in this unresolved space, between fact, theory, and imagination, the Mary Celeste continues to drift in the collective consciousness, an enduring testament to the mysteries the sea can create, even without storms, monsters, or violence. After the Mary Celeste was salvaged and the legal proceedings concluded, she did not fade into obscurity. Instead, the ship became a living symbol, her silent decks and absent crew transforming her into an icon of maritime mystery that would endure for generations. What had begun as a commercial voyage ended as a story that blurred the line between history and legend, fact and imagination. The ship herself continued to sail under new ownership, her name and appearance unchanged. Yet she carried with her the weight of notoriety. Mariners and merchants recognized her, not merely as a vessel, but as a phenomenon. Captains who had previously ignored her history now approached her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. The Mary Celeste became a reminder of the sea's capacity to confound, a lesson that even the most disciplined preparation cannot entirely negate the influence of unforeseen circumstances. Authors and journalists of the late 19th and early 20th centuries seized upon the story, embellishing details for dramatic effect. Tales of ghostly figures, spectral apparitions, and inexplicable disappearances multiplied. often overshadowing the sober facts recorded by boarding parties and investigators. Despite these exaggerations, the underlying truth, the ship was seaworthy, the crew experienced, the abandonment deliberate, remained intact, allowing the legend to coexist with historical record. The Mary Celeste story also resonated in maritime law and practice. Salvage procedures, navigational safety, and risk assessment were discussed in the context of her case. And her disappearance prompted renewed attention to the handling of hazardous cargo, the proper use of lifeboats, and the psychological pressures experienced by crews on long transatlantic voyages. She became a reference point for both cautionary tales and scholarly study, a vessel whose history illuminated practical as well as cultural concerns. In popular culture, the Mary Celeste achieved immortality. Stories about her appeared in newspapers, magazines, and eventually in books, plays, and films. Each retelling amplified the mystery, yet each also anchored it in the context of human experience. Ordinary men and women facing the extraordinary, making careful decisions under uncertainty, and leaving behind traces that would puzzle future generations. Her decks, her cabin, her cargo. Every element became a symbol in a narrative that was both real and mythologized. Yet the fascination endured not merely because of spectacle, but because of the human element. Captain Briggs, his wife Sarah, daughter Sophia, and the crew represented the ordinary, confronting the unpredictable. Their choices, made with reason and care, produced outcomes that were unknowable to anyone outside their immediate experience. The Mary Celeste teaches that the sea is not merely a physical environment, but a space in which judgment, perception, and contingency converge, creating consequences that are at once comprehensible and inexplicable. Over time, historians, maritime scholars, and enthusiasts revisited the records, logs, and testimonies associated with the ship. New theories emerged with each generation, drawing on advances in chemistry, meteorology, and psychology. Some emphasized alcohol fumes, others pointed to microbursts of weather or subtle navigational errors. Each explanation offered insight, yet none could provide absolute certainty. This persistent ambiguity cemented the Mary Celeste's place not just in history, but in the imagination, a story that resists final resolution because the evidence itself is tantalizingly complete and yet fundamentally silent. By the 20th century, the Mary Celeste had become emblematic of the mysteries the ocean can hold. She inspired writers, filmmakers, and artists who portrayed her both as a ghost ship and as a testament to human vulnerability in the face of nature. Museums, maritime societies, and scholars referenced her story as an example of how historical events acquire layers of meaning over time, merging the factual, the speculative, and the symbolic. Even today, the Mary Celeste story continues to captivate. Exhibits and documentaries explore her construction, her voyages, the careful records of Captain Briggs, and the meticulous observations made by those who later boarded her. The ship serves as a bridge between historical reality and human imagination, offering lessons about decision-making, preparation, and the enduring unpredictability of life at sea. Ultimately, the Mary Celeste's legacy is defined not by catastrophe, nor by discovery alone, but by the intersection of ordinary human lives with forces beyond comprehension. She reminds us that even carefully reasoned choices can lead to outcomes that challenge expectation, and that the allure of mystery persists when evidence is complete yet inconclusive. In this, she is both a historical artifact and a narrative vessel, carrying her story across time as effectively as she once carried cargo across the Atlantic. The fascination she inspires endures because she embodies the essential tension of maritime life, the relentless stability of preparation confronted by the sea's capacity for the unexpected. In that tension, the Mary Celeste remains unique, a ship that is at once fully understood and profoundly unknowable, a legend built upon the solid foundation of history. More than a century after the Mary Celeste's silent crossing of the Atlantic, the questions surrounding her abandonment remain as compelling as ever. Modern historians, maritime experts, and enthusiasts continue to study her story, drawn not by scandal or sensationalism, but by the subtle complexity of her case. A ship intact, a crew experienced, a captain careful, and yet, inexplicably, no one remained aboard. Today, the Mary Celeste serves as both a historical artifact and a lens through which we can examine human decision-making in uncertain environments. Advances in chemistry, meteorology, and psychology have illuminated aspects of the story that were poorly understood in the 1870s. Studies suggest that alcohol vapors from leaking barrels could have created an environment perceived as dangerous, especially in confined spaces. Slight water ingress, combined with the movement of the ship in swells, could have convinced even an experienced captain that temporary evacuation was the safest choice. Yet, even with this knowledge, no theory fully explains why the crew never returned. The ship's story has inspired generations of storytelling, but unlike many legends, it is grounded in meticulous historical records. Captain Briggs's logbooks, the testimonies of the Dei Gratia's crew, and the official salvage proceedings provide a detailed framework within which speculation can occur. Each piece of evidence reinforces the notion that the abandonment was deliberate, measured, and undertaken with caution rather than panic. The Mary Celeste, in her silent presence, teaches that the human mind often acts on perceived threats that may be far more consequential than reality itself. Researchers today continue to examine the psychological pressures faced by sailors at sea. The isolation, the constant motion, and the slow accumulation of small ambiguous signals that can magnify anxiety or perceived danger. The Mary Celeste exemplifies how rational decision-making interacts with uncertainty, showing that even experience and preparation cannot guarantee control over outcomes. The story resonates beyond maritime history, offering insights into risk assessment, leadership, and human perception. In cultural terms, the Mary Celeste has become a universal symbol of mystery. She appears in novels, films, television series, and even video games, yet her historical reality remains clear to those who study the evidence. She is not a ghost ship in the literal sense, but the emotional power of her story, the absence, the silence, the unanswered questions, has given her an enduring place in collective imagination. Her legacy illustrates the tension between what we know and what we wish to understand, a tension that the sea itself has long imposed upon humankind. Archaeological interest in the Mary Celeste has been limited, as the ship was eventually broken up for scrap. But her influence persists in maritime scholarship and popular culture alike. Modern discussions of her case emphasize not only the mystery, but also the context, the habits, skills, and judgment of a disciplined crew operating under ordinary conditions that, collectively, produced extraordinary results. In studying her, we examine not just the vessel, but the human capacity to respond, adapt, and sometimes misinterpret the world around them. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Mary Celeste is the quietness of her story. There was no violent storm that tore her apart, no dramatic attack by pirates, no fiery explosion to mark the end of life aboard her decks. Instead, the narrative is subtle, almost imperceptible, constructed from normal logs, minor cargo shifts, and deliberate actions taken in response to perceived risk. The ship's silence is not emptiness, but a form of testimony, a reminder that history often resides in what was done, what was left behind, and what was never fully explained. The Mary Celeste continues to challenge assumptions. She asks us to consider how ordinary circumstances, wind, cargo, bilge water, and human judgment can converge into outcomes that appear extraordinary to those observing from afar. Her story teaches patience in interpretation, respect for evidence, and humility before the unpredictability of both the sea and human decision-making. In the end, the Mary Celeste is more than a ship. She is a story about people navigating uncertainty, about choices made in good faith that produced consequences beyond anticipation, and about the persistent allure of unanswered questions. She embodies the intersection of history and mystery, the space where facts meet imagination, and the enduring reminder that the sea, with all its constancy and unpredictability, will always hold secrets beyond our reach. Her journey may have ended, but the story of the Mary Celeste continues to sail across time, carried by the curiosity, wonder, and reflection of every generation that hears her tale. And in that, she is truly timeless. A vessel not only of wood and canvas, but of history, human experience, and the mystery that will never fully be solved.